Yes, one moment, please. Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, students, friends, and colleagues. Thank you for coming in this public forum today. Our speaker for today is Dr. Andrew Ross, a member of the Faculty of Art and Social Sciences, University of Sydney, Australia. Thank you for making the time to share your knowledge with us, Dr. Ross. This is such a great honor for us to have you with us today. This forum is sponsored by the International Research Collaboration World Class University Universitas Indonesia under the leadership of Ms. Harni Kartika, PhD. Thank you, Harni, for making this event possible. So today we already have the head of the Linguistics Study Program of FIBUI. Thank you for coming, Dr. Triaswarin Sutanari Hesti, whom I usually call Ririt, Dr. Ririt. Yeah, okay. Please allow me to invite Dr. Ririt to give an opening remark.
Thank you, Dr. Sonia. And morning, ladies and gentlemen. Hopefully, all of you are doing well today. Yeah. And first of all, on behalf of the Faculty of Humanities, Universitas Indonesia, please allow me to welcome you and thank you for making the time to attend this webinar, this forum. And I also would like to express my sincere appreciation to the organizer of this event, Dr. Harni Kartika. Thank you. And also Regina, yeah, and it is especially a great moment to have Dr. Andrew Ross with us today. And thank you very much, Dr. Ross, and for coming and to discuss this topic, cycling and selfies, exploring intersubjectivity in the context of sport. I think this topic is certainly interesting because it is closely related to our daily lives. Yeah, and selfies while doing fun activities and posting them on Instagram have also become, let's say, a trend for people in Indonesia. And the social phenomenon can certainly be interesting issues for people, especially for researcher and also for the students here. Yeah, and I believe today is going to be a great day for us because we are here in order to enrich our insights and knowledge regarding the topic of this talk. Now, well, I don't want to take much of your time. I need to hand over it to Dr. Sonia Suganda, our moderator, to lead the discussion. Please, Dr. Sonia.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Ririt. Yeah, okay. I have to agree with you, Dr. Ririt, when you say that cycling is already part of our lives, yeah. And Dr. Ross, Dr. Ririt is from the Dutch studies, and from I heard, and as far as I know, in Holland, there are so many people, doing cyclists, right?
Yes,
so
yes,
it is, yeah, right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So let's move on to the next agenda. We have a photo session now coming up. So I have to ask you, maybe if you could turn on your camera for a little while and give us your big smile. This is very important for the documentation of this event. So kindly turn on your camera. Thank you. Yes, and Mbak Regina will help us with the photo session. Please, Mbak Regina.
Okay, I'm gonna take 2 or 3 pictures.
Yes.
1, 2, 3, senyum. Oke, tunggu sebentar ya. Please wait a moment. Okay, I'm gonna take one more. 1, 2, 3. Smile, everyone. Thank you very much. Okay, I get the photo. Thank you. Okay.
Is Dr. Sonia's freezing? Might be.
I was wondering what was happening there. Do you want me to start or?
Yeah, maybe she's sending me a text. Dr. Sonia? Oh, yeah, she's all right. So maybe you can put on start just to start your presentation.
Okay. All right. Let's just get it set up. Hopefully you can all see that beautiful orange University of Sydney PowerPoint. Yeah, is that clear to everybody?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Okay. All right. Yeah. So, hi everyone. I hope everyone's well, and thanks for having me along. In particular, I just want to thank Hani for showing an interest in my work and for reaching out in the first instance. Hani, it was nice to have that initial chat on Zoom with you, and I'm delighted now to be able to talk to all of you about this. Thanks also to everyone involved in running the session and hosting the session, supporting it and so on, and of course all of you for being here. It's a bit earlier there than it is here, so I don't know if maybe that's reduced numbers a little bit or not. So yeah, and given the last couple of years how we've been kind of starved of the chance to engage in sort of interpersonal communication like this in presenting type of context, it's certainly nice to have that opportunity as well. In fact, I guess that's one of the things that's come out of COVID, isn't it? A lot more sort of seeking out of these kinds of opportunities among different institutions and so on that we might not have done virtually previously. So as you can see from the title, I'll be talking about selfies in relation to the concept of intersubjectivity, drawing on a study that I did with Michelle Zapavinia, who I think some of you here may have met earlier this year, or who may be familiar with her work. Her work in the area of the social semiotics of social media is quite widely known and respected in the field now. So what I'll be talking about today is something I did with her, and that we are sort of continuing to pursue in some way, shape and form. So I hope you enjoy the talk, and I look forward to engaging with your questions and discussion at the end. So you may or may not be familiar with my work to date, but the overwhelming focus of my research in recent years has been the domain of new media communication and discourse, especially on various social media platforms. Some, I think, might say that my research focus has been perhaps eclectic, as I've done work in areas such as political communication, environmental communication, food discourse, sports discourse like today's talk, live streaming, and other things too. But this is really because I think this is what research in new media lends itself to. There's simply just so many ways that people engage with social media and other forms of new media, and about so many different topics that they all kind of warrant some attention in my view. So although the topics I have addressed do vary, I've kind of focused a lot on popular forms of new and social media, in particular Twitter, Instagram, as I'll talk about today, and internet memes and these kinds of things as well. So yeah, as you can see on this slide, in this kind of somewhat shameless act of self-promotion, I've just plastered this slide with a few titles of some of my papers just to give us a sense of that, I guess, that variety in the work that's possible within social media and new media and looking at language and communication practices. I sort of think it highlights that potential that's there for research. So I mentioned Instagram in those platforms that I look at, and I've looked at that in different contexts too, but in the context of sport being one of those. So I'll be sort of looking today at the merging of sport as a domain of experience, I guess, and Instagram as a social media platform. And more specifically, I'll talk about how amateur cyclists engage with Instagram, and I'll hone in on the selfie and explore and discuss the different selfie types that emerge in cyclist Instagram discourse. And throughout the talk, I'll draw on an analytical framework or a typology developed by Michelle and her colleague Sumin Zhao, who some of you may be familiar with Sumin as well, and see how the data from cyclists presents opportunities for extending this framework. So throughout the talk, I'll largely follow the kind of periodicity of the paper that I have already published with Michelle. And in fact, doing this talk has been quite good because I hadn't thought about this paper for a little while, to be honest, but it's nice to be able to actually return to it. And I'll point you in the direction of that paper and some others a bit later as well. And yeah, so I'll sort of follow the flow of that paper, and at the end, yeah, direct you to other work I've done. I'm pretty sure I sort of did a test run of this talk. I don't think I'll run out of time. I know I've got 40 minutes, so Hani, be strict with me, keep me to that. But we'll see how we go. Okay, so this project emerged out of a range of things, really. First and foremost, I had been, at the time I did this study, I had been working a lot on social media discourse, as I mentioned earlier, and was starting to get into working with Instagram specifically. I'm a cyclist, and beyond being a cyclist, I'm also just a big fan of the sport in general. You know, I'll watch the Tour de France and all the televised races and all this kind of thing as well. I follow many cycling-related Instagram accounts, whether it be, you know, particular cyclists or brands and that kind of thing. And what I had seen on a lot of these accounts in terms of the way that the users presented themselves and their sport struck me as kind of a rich site for study. On top of this, I could see at the time some nice alignment with the research that Michelle and Sumin had already done and was still doing at that time. And I wondered how cycling might present an opportunity to further extend their work. And then finally, so in 2020, I proposed a special issue for the journal Discourse, Context and Media on the topic of sports and new media discourse. So I had a suitable venue lined up for where what the work I was thinking about would fit. And, you know, as editor of that special issue, I knew that it sort of aligned quite well with my vision for that particular issue of the journal. From there, I teamed up with Michelle, and it went from there, really. So you can see a lot of things came together ranging from interest in social media, interest in the sport, sort of having an idea in mind for where this kind of work might fit, and a colleague who I wanted to work with. So all these things kind of came together. So there's no doubt that social media continues to grow and develop really quickly. Through its use, we've seen kind of an equal growth in the intensified focus on the daily lives of users and the everyday activities that they engage in, whether they be, you know, the mundane or they be activities that are actually more active. And sport's a good example of this. I guess a good way to sort of think about the difference in that, the mundane versus the more active is you could look at Michelle's earlier work on coffee. She did selfies around people. She looked at selfies taken by people when they're having coffee. So that's kind of a mundane everyday activity, but in it sort of no less contributes to the daily activities of those engaging in it. Sport is more active in the physical sense, but there's a similarity in terms of how people are presented. And so as I'm focusing on Instagram, we also have to acknowledge that self-presentation is a central element of people engaging with that platform. In many cases, it's the only goal, so that friends and followers and others can gain an insight into the things that one finds interesting, exciting, attractive, meaningful, and so on. So it's probably not surprising that sport is an area where social media is really popular. However, what I had found was much prior research on sport and new media and sport and social media had tended to focus on other aspects beyond merely the self, and certainly not so much looking at selfies. Some of these previous work looked more at things like engagement and connections between fans and teams and athletes, or community building among those who like a sport, or fashion and equipment, these type of things. And also it had focused more on professional sport rather than the everyday amateur, non-professional athlete, enthusiast, if you like. So I did see a bit of a gap there that could be filled. So we're all familiar with the term selfie, but perhaps not so much with the nuanced interpretations that it offers. Traditional understandings were mainly based around kind of mirror selfies, which are self-explanatory. And then what was called the ego shot, which is still a very common one, which is that kind of, with a phone, arm extended, looking back to yourself. So these were two of the more traditional understandings of what a selfie was. However, this didn't capture the range of sort of nuances and different relations and subjectivities and intersubjectivities that were possible. And as we'll see today in my talk, as well as in other work by Michelle and Sumin and now others, selfies don't even necessitate a face being visible to be able to be called a selfie. And this is some of the, these are some of the nuances we've started to look into. And, importantly, selfies can be used and are used to communicate something with others and send messages about the self or aspects of the self. There's been research on subjectivities that suggests selfies both mediate and produce subjectivities, which helps to differentiate selfies from more traditional, kind of old-fashioned pre-social media kind of portrait type photography. But we've now started to move into newer understandings of selfies with a focus on the intersubjectivities they offer. It's been said that a selfie represents the photographer, including the face or a part of the body or a reflection, etc. And it's in these types of, variations where the nuance resides when compared to more traditional definitions. Now, where subjectivity refers to projection of the self, intersubjectivity refers to the notion of perspective. So it moves beyond just simple self-representation towards an idea of articulating the perspective or a range of perspectives about the self. And further, Gillespie and Cornish talk about how intersubjectivity relates to this variety of relations between them, and we'll see some of these shortly. Okay, sorry. So the study I conducted with Michelle, and that I'm talking about here, adopted hers and Sumin's typology, which outlined features of different selfie types. Some of you may be familiar with the paper that I've cited here. The types outlined, they divided into what they call meta and then meta perspectives, and further sort of subdivided into presented, mirrored, inferred, implied, and still life self-images. They're distinguished on the basis of their representational and compositional choices. I guess, in other words, what we're looking at what's in the image and how it's organized, taking into account things like the angles and what also not just what's in the image, but what's excluded and what that leads us to kind of imply or infer. So these types of selfies create different types of intersubjective relations through the types of perspectives that they construe, and their mediation via technology. They each realize a different type of intersubjective relation in which the photographer's perspective is open for negotiation. And that's kind of that implying that nuance that's there in a lot of the types of images we'll look at. On the next slides, I'll give a quick overview of what some examples of these types of selfies look like, in line with Michelle and Sumin's original paper, before we get into the further nuanced interpretations that came from our own study. This is a presented selfie. It offers us a meta perspective and is what might be considered a classic selfie, like I just described, that kind of extended arm holding the camera or holding the phone. So it does kind of align with those traditional definitions. The face and the upper body are visible, and there's that extended arm that I just mentioned. These selfies may at times also include additional representational elements like other participants or objects as well. While this type of selfie offers the photographer's perspective on the self, it's not a direct perspective, since it's mediated by the technology used to produce the image, typically the front camera on a smartphone. So we can say that this image communicates the cyclist's perspective, technologically mediated by their representation of themselves as a cyclist. So that's the first type. Probably no surprise that a mirrored selfie looks like this. So mirrored selfie, pretty self-explanatory. It offers a meta perspective because it's even less kind of, it's more mediated, I guess, than the previous example. There are two layers to the mediation that can vary in their degrees of explicitness. As this is also the case in the other types that I'll explain on the other slides. So here, the image is mediated by the technology, i.e. the phone, as well as by the mirror. So it's mediated by the mirror and the phone at the same time. And it doesn't have to be a mirror. It could be any other kind of reflective surface, like a shiny table or, a window or something like that as well. But most typically they tend to be this kind. So this particular image therefore includes the photographer, a smartphone, and the reflective surface that enables this type. This is an inferred selfie. And this and the next couple of types actually offer the self's perspective on the self's perspective of a certain phenomenon. They just differ in terms of how explicitly the self is represented in the image. The most explicit representation of the self in this and the following two types is in inferred selfies like this, where part of the body of the photographer is included. So, for instance, the legs are shown here, and the low position, obviously chosen for kind of effect, and allows us to infer that the perspective on the bike and the self is given to us by the device kind of pointing back. We have to kind of try and infer what's exactly going on. I assume it's the cyclist reaching over and taking that shot. This is an implied selfie. So these do not include body parts, as you can see. However, what we can say is that the compositional choices allow us to imply the photographer's, well, first of all, imply the photographer's presence, and second of all, imply that this is their perspective. So the angle and the position of the bike, as well as the blurred background suggesting movement, indicate a mounted cyclist who is the photographer of this as well. So there's no hint of the body, and it's probably at about this point that a lot of, traditional understandings of a selfie start to become things start to get a little bit blurred, because what's the self and where is the self? I can't see any part of the body. I can't see a face, but it is the self's perspective on this phenomenon, which is the kind of, so we're starting to get into these variations in perspectives and relations that Michelle and Sumin were originally talking about. This is a still life self-image selfie. These are maximally implicit in terms of the representation of the self. The photographer's perspective is suggested by the presence of personal objects, usually carefully arranged in the image or placed in a certain way to get a good shot, or often shot from a kind of downward perspective, particularly in the context of cycling. In cases like this, some knowledge of the context, i.e. cycling, is what we're looking at today, and the affordances of the social media platform, i.e. the understanding that the feed of images is produced by a unique self or person. This kind of knowledge is required for someone to actually be able to read an image like this as a selfie. Otherwise, the inclination might be not to. So this is the kind of expanded, interpretation that we're starting to get into. So those are the categories that Michelle and Sumin came up with. So we're looking at cycling. I'll go now through a little bit of what we did in this particular study in terms of the data collection and the procedure. I mentioned earlier, my own interest in golf, but I guess, part of the rationale or motivation for this study is also the rapidly growing popularity of the sport in general. It's even been called the new golf, which I think is an interesting way to look at it. And that sort of explains the vast number of this growing popularity. Kind of explains the vast number of cycling-related hashtags that are out there on Instagram, like there are with many other social activities. So there were quite a lot, but 5 of the most popular were these ones that we came across: hashtag cycling, hashtag cycling life, cyclist, from where I ride, and Insta cycling. Each of these had, from memory, well over 1 million posts. So by now it's probably, multiple millions now. We chose to focus on the one that I've highlighted in yellow here, From Where I Ride, because I had used this already in another study looking at Instagram and cycling from a bit more of a sort of sociological angle, that paper. And the hashtag was useful because, I guess a good choice because it focuses more on the everyday cyclist and the Instagram user. And also, ones like I found as well, things like the top three, cycling life, cyclist. I found they had a lot of crossover in their feeds with motorcycle riding. So I didn't want motorcycling to be sort of blurring the sort of data we were trying to get at. So we focused on this, and data collection. What we did was we collected on the day that we did data collection. At the time we did it, we just took the first 5 posts that we saw on that day, and then for each of those 5 users, they were different users for each post. We then collected the first 30 posts about cycling from those users. So we ended up with 150, and then we went and contacted them via Instagram and got their permission to use their images in our work, and they were very happy to do so, fortunately. I should say too, on that, this is a little ethical thing, but I have found Instagram users are very responsive to sending a simple message in the app to say, hey, I'm writing a paper, I'd love to use your photos as data. Is that okay? I have found very, very responsive users, and they're usually very keen. So if anyone's thinking of that in the future, that's a good little tip, it certainly, will help you overcome that ethical hurdle of using people's data. The thing with Instagram data is even if it's in the public domain, which it is, like a public account, journals and books and so on still want permissions for using images. So keep that in mind. Okay, so you've seen the overarching framework and some sample images of those categories. I'll now go into our analysis to try and point out some of the posts from our data set that we felt provided more nuance and helped to extend that original typology of Michelle and Sumit. We will see some differences in perspective in the images that I'll show you next, and I think I felt this is tied to the actual manner in which they are unique to cycling and may not be in other contexts. And I'm sure as this kind of work continues, there's going to be other contexts where there's even more nuance that's not applicable to having a coffee and not applicable to cycling. So this is where this kind of research is quite exciting, because there's so many contexts that people engage with this type of social media use. I'll also outline a new type of selfie that we felt came from the study. I think I'm almost at about 30 minutes. Is that what you've got? Hani?
We can have until 10, Andy. We have time until 10
Okay.
Our time. So it's about 20 more minutes. Is it okay?
That should be fine. Okay. Cool. Okay, so what we're looking at now, so the titles of the next slide are returning to those types that I already gave some examples of, but now we're looking at some different variations, right, from the data of our study. So presented selfies, as I said before, this is a very common type of selfie, and it was also a very common type of selfie in our data. in most cases, they tended to, the ones in our data tended to follow the traditional features of this type, like the the photographer being foregrounded in the center of the frame, and then the extended arm looking back, that kind of thing that I showed you before. However, it wasn't always the case, and we did see some variations. So, for example, look at the image on the left here. We can see that the cyclist's face is foregrounded, but the central position in the frame has now been kind of handed over to the background. In the background, we see the road continuing off into the distance. Although the face is still visible and the angle of the shot and the absence of the cyclist's hand, all these things kind of confirm to the viewer the technological mediation involved, but a different perspective is being offered. What we see the most of in this image is not the cyclist. What we see the most of is the road and the background. And it kind of functions as a, you know, in an interpersonal way, as a kind of invitation to enjoy the same view. An invitation to join with this cyclist on this ride, rather than sort of blocking that by having the cyclist body in the middle of the frame. There were other variations as well, and we saw numerous examples like the image on the right. The rider is again foregrounded, and we do see the outstretched arm, but in a somewhat unconventional way, kind of deliberately behind the body. And also in this one too, the central position of the frame is perhaps not handed over as completely as the image on the left, but it's fighting for attention with the view of the rider from behind. So this prompted us to expand the definition of the presented selfie to cater for these variations in perspective. For instance, while the viewer, when we look at these, we are still offered a technologically mediated representation of the self, but there's more to it. The depiction of the road and the camera's position presents us with the cyclist's perspective on a phenomenon, i.e. the road, their route, their sport. And in other words, we're being kind of invited to share the gaze of the cyclist in a form of, you know, I guess, mediated co-presence in a way. And this deviates a bit from existing understandings of gaze in photography, as normally we wouldn't think that a rider looking away from the viewer with their face hidden would represent, we would think that would represent less involvement. But I think the opposite is here. It's that kind of invitation to join in. So it's kind of more involved because of the compositional and representational features of the image. So we can say that involvement and intersubjective relations are not completely dependent on gaze. And therefore, we need to look at the co-constructed visual features to work out what's happening. And so it also led us with these ones to think about whether they should actually be considered presented selfies at all, as opposed to a selfie type offering, you know, more of an implied or inferred perspective, like some of the later types. I think the nuance is there enough to lead us to question some of these things a little bit more. Perhaps unsurprisingly, there were not many traditional mirrored selfies in the data, and that's likely because they require a window or a mirror, which are things that cyclists, when they're out for a long ride, they don't really come across them very much. So, you know, we weren't really surprised to not see many, but something else did emerge that we found interesting, a new kind of intersubjective relation. And you can see in these two images on my slide, this is the different variation that I'm going to explain. So we thought these align most logically with the mirrored selfie type, but also kind of projected a meta perspective through shadow, not through reflection. When you look closely at the one on the left, for example, you can kind of just distinguish the handlebars of the bike from the shadow of the body, which is essential to make explicit the subject of the image. However, in the image on the right, it's a bit harder, I think, to discern a bike or the bike. I mean, you can kind of see them, but it's not quite as obvious as the one on the left, I think. So if we look only at the image, the activity of cycling is not really implicit and it's not really explicit either. In other words, the image itself, by itself, without any of the text on the right, would not necessarily reveal the activity. So here, intermodal affordances are important. And I've done some work on this in the other cycling-related paper I'll list at the end. So, for instance, on the left, the textual component of the post says simply riding, which is very helpful, right, to clarify what actually is happening in the image, because all we've got is shadow. And there are also many cycling hashtags like after work ride, road bike, and a few others. In addition, these relations tie together some of the aspects of the sport that are typically valued by cyclists, like being out in nature, fitness, overall cycling lifestyle, and a few other things. So the verbiage here is actually critical to the working out how explicit or how implicit it is what's happening in the image. So this again forces us to review the intersubjective relations in images like this. For instance, if we think about the representational nature of the post, we have to think about the shadow or silhouette of the photographer rather than a mirror image. In these images, the camera phone remains implicit rather than explicit, as it is in mirror selfies, because in the mirror you can see the phone, right, when you're doing that, but you can't in these ones. You would have no clue who's taking that actual photo in the second one. Further, the possibilities for precisely what the representation is mediated by need to be broadened. Normally it's a mirror, as I've said, but it's not here. So we were left kind of asking whether the representation of self is it being mediated by the road with the shadow on it? Or is it being mediated by the sun, which produces the shadow? Or the body, the photographer's body, which is also required to produce the shadow? So there was, we talked about these images quite a lot, and sort of think they belong here, but I think that images like this, still a lot of work can be done on this kind of thing. Okay, yeah. So with the image being mediated by really what we can only consider natural processes, we thought that the interpretation of the relation needs to be expanded to allow for kind of a broader understanding. Okay. Oops, sorry. I think I left one off there somehow. I think I might have skipped a slide. Anyway, I think I've skipped a slide because I've got text ready to talk about one slide, the inferred selfies, but I think it'll probably be good to jump onto this one anyway, just in terms of the time we've got left. So in cycling, we also found that the implied selfie type matches up with the features outlined by Michelle and Sumin, with the post showing an object that implies the presence of the photographer. So the one on the left is kind of similar to the one I showed earlier. what I wanted to note here is that although these are technically, by Michelle and Sumin's definition, they are implied selfies, there's not really much difference between an implied and an inferred selfie when you kind of think about it. For instance, in the image on the left, if the cyclist had just one hand on the left handlebar, it's an inferred selfie because it has that body part that the typology says. It just makes it a little bit more explicit. But I think you can also argue that the hand being there or not doesn't necessarily tell us that much more, even though in terms of an actual category, it has been defined as such. So in either case, inferred or implied, a point of view is established where the viewer can't, when you look at the one on the left, you can't really help but imagine being positioned in the saddle of the bike, flying along on the road, looking at the blurred tarmac beneath you. So it's quite that evocative nature of the post is there regardless. Another example is like the one on the right, which didn't differ too greatly from the original interpretations of Michelle and Sumin. Where it got a little bit more interesting was something like here. We can see a bit of overlap here between the images of implied selfies from our data and the category of still life self-images. The still life self-image idea relates to the promotion of people's kind of personal belongings as important objects. If we consider how these kinds of images are constructed visually, together with their context and the social media affordances, we can consider the manner in which an image can indirectly represent the self, and then how that representation can be recontextualized across different domains of experience. So, I mean, look at this image. It foregrounds the photographer's bicycle, and together with the co-text of the hashtags and the caption, it allows the viewer to read the bicycle as a kind of extended self. This one's a common visual pattern in our data set of a bike against a landscape, usually also featuring the road along which the photographer has been cycling. In this case, though, the bike is in the background of the bike is a famous the Dolomites in Italy, which cyclists can read into very famous area for riding. So that sort of adds to the representation of self going on there, and I guess further aestheticizes the experience. Nice bike, beautiful view, sort of boasting to people looking at it about, look where I am. Now, I just wanted to very quickly go into this last type, because this is the type that Michelle and I felt was something new. So we say it's new as we found that it didn't fit neatly into any of those other previously defined categories. And yeah, these two on the slide are examples of this. So in each of these posts, the way the technology is placed, and the technology is a GoPro, which we assume from the hashtags used. So the way the technology is placed gives us a unique feature in the images. They certainly do offer a meta perspective, and they do give a perspective on a phenomenon, but the inferred and implied presence of the photographer is weakened by the camera being placed on the ground. I actually spoke with this person, this user, and I do know that he was out by himself riding, and he deliberately placed his GoPro on the ground by himself. but you can't know that without asking. So it becomes kind of less and less clear about who is actually taking these photos and so on. We can assume, but the more we assume, it sort of highlights how much less explicit it is. So the perspective of this image relies on the technological affordances of the device, like a timed photo, which allows the viewer to, in effect, see through the technology. We're not seeing through the eyes of what the photographer sees at the same time, because the photographer is on the bike, right? So essentially, the presence of the technology is required to establish the connection or the intersubjective relation that exists here. So at this endpoint of our study, we actually ended up proposing an extension of the selfie typology to include a new kind of relation, which we kind of viewed as the perspective being articulated through the self's perspective on a technologically mediated representation of technology's perspective of a particular phenomenon. So it's kind of on either end of this kind of relation is self and phenomenon, but in the middle are kind of two kind of additional steps. And what we came up with were, for a name for this type, was device vision selfies. That was the new name we proposed, device vision selfies. And we have talked about doing more work on this. We haven't yet, but I'm sure we will at some point. So overall, our study served to do a few things. First, it did demonstrate the validity and applicability of Zhao and Zapovinya's typology of selfies. Our data and the posts that we analysed did adhere to this. However, as I've discussed, we were able to expand the typology a bit in both the sense of broadening the interpretations, but also proposing a new selfie type. The different interpretations included variations on the presented selfie, as well as something a bit different with the shadows in that examples in that mirrored selfie category. And importantly, what those shadowed ones in the mirrored selfie category showed was the important role that the intermodal relationship, intermodal affordances can play. The caption and the hashtags really can make something that is not explicit in the slightest actually quite explicit, even if the image doesn't show that. And then I presented this new selfie type of the device vision selfie, which we felt a unique and novel finding and something that we hope to explore more. And I think probably will become even more relevant as work in this area increases and focuses on new technologies like drones, for example. I think drones and the photography done by drones is something that will fit into this device vision selfie category quite nicely. Just need to get a research grant to buy some drones, and then I can do it. Here is some other work of mine on cycling, and Hani, if you like, I'll send you these slides after the talk, if that would be helpful. But yeah, I've done a couple of things on another paper on Instagram, a recent paper on YouTube channels and how they represent a cycling place, and I did another one a while ago about metaphors in cycling commentary. So you can see the interest in cycling is definitely there, and I'll just put as well into the chat if that's okay.
Yeah, that's okay.
Let me just see where it is. Here we go. Okay. So what I'm putting in the chat is actually someone from a well-known cycling online magazine contacted me and wanted to write something about my research in that magazine, which which was really good because, you know, we often get kind of stuck in the scholarly world, you know, the academic world. And it was really good to be able to, you know, I got a lot of feedback I got more feedback on this online article that was written in that link than I have about the papers, because real cyclists who have no idea about academia read it. And that's really where it's interesting to know if our research has any relevance or impact at all, right? If the layperson more than the, you know, the PhD qualified academic and so on. So that's interesting to look at as well. But yeah, 2:01, well, here anyway, 10:01. I've just made it. So thanks very much for listening. I'll send these slides on to Hani, and Hani can pass them on to anyone who's interested.